Good afternoon. Welcome to this next session. Uh, it's going to be a 30-minute session, and there may be a little time for questions at the end. If not, Sarah has agreed to maybe chat with you out in the hall afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Sarah Kaiser, and she's going to speak with the very interesting title of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Development Environment.
Well, thank you so much. I am really excited to be here at my first PyCon and get to talk to you about two of my favorite things, actually. Well, three favorite, because here's my dog. I live in Seattle. I'm a cloud developer advocate at Microsoft. And I do a lot of things outside of coding, mainly boating in the Seattle area and playing Final Fantasy stuff. So if you're on Final Fantasy 14, find me outside afterwards. I will friend you. But yeah, the title of our talk today is not actually a reference to the movie. When I started kind of digging into this, I was like, oh, this actually comes from a poem from the 16th century? From the year 1717 by Alexander Pope, and it's basically a sequence of love letters between Abelard, who was kind of a tutor, and one of his star pupils, Eloisa. And so we're gonna read some actual poetry here before we get to the talk, but yeah, how happy is the blameless Vestal's lot, the world forgetting by the world forgot, eternal sunshine of the spotless mind, each prayer accepted, each wish resigned, labor and rest that equal periods keep, obedient slumbers that waken sleep, desires composed, affections ever even, tears that delight and sighs that waft to heaven. And as I was reading this, I was like, this actually kind of reminds me of my work. Although probably better work-life balance from the labor and rest and equal periods keep. I'm not sure we're at equal periods. But poetry is really nice to hear, but when you're actually working and developing and writing code, what is your least favorite thing to hear? And please shout out things. Works on my machine or doesn't work on my machine? Oh, you took down the company? Yeah, that's probably force push to prod. Not great option. Resources not available. Ooh, or permission denied. All of those are pretty great. Oh, yeah, just nothing with prod. But yeah. My least favorite thing to hear is it, as a lot of folks here said, it doesn't work on my machine. My background as a scientist, a lot of times we had devices, we had setups in the lab, everyone had their own machines, and with a lot of folks that are, if you're collaborating at all with anyone else, replicating those development environments can be a huge pain. So what we're going to talk about today is a cool open standard called dev containers. So I'll introduce you to what this open spec is. I'll give you two kind of examples of how you can actually use this in both open source contribution settings and possibly teaching or workshops that probably a lot of you here have either attended or given at PyCon. So first question is, what is a dev container? Probably raise your hand if you've used Docker before. Okay, for the record, that is pretty much everyone. Docker containers are a type of container, containerization, very, very hip, very cool. But a lot of times, this usually is a way of describing how or where your code gets run. So it's really focused on actually containerizing or separating the actual code execution piece of it, which is great because then it's portable, you can host it lots of different places, it's easier to scale things. But that doesn't necessarily incorporate all the parts of working on your code. So dev containers is kind of like, I imagine it as Docker and, it's the improv version, but it adds specifications for the environment around your development pieces around your container. So if you can absolutely take a look at the spec. Containers.dev is a great resource for literally everything about these. And yeah, so you might say, where can you actually use these? What interprets these? It was born out of kind of a VS Code and GitHub collaboration, but there are lots of different products and tools that actually have started adopting this open spec, including PyCharm, DevBox, Jetify, DevPod. I'm trying to remember all the logos here. All of the tools are listed on that containers.dev webpage, but I think it's really exciting that it's kind of gaining momentum like this, so that, you know, I use a lot of VS Code at work, but I also have folks who like using PyCharm, and so being able to have a description of, you know, what you need to work on this project that is kind of portable between those is really pretty great. Docker just crashed on my machine. So those are a bunch of different products and or tools you can use with them, but you know, if we kind of break those down into categories, you can use dev containers with if you have Docker installed locally on your machine, and then you can use a local editor like VS Code or PyCharm, things like that. You can use them with code spaces on GitHub, so that's kind of the main way actually code spaces builds or understands what it should stand up for you. And you could also just separately use them in cloud hosting services. So things like DevPod and stuff like that will just read that configuration. Obviously, some of the settings there may not be relevant if it's in a headless mode, but other things might still be. So here's like the most basic dev container I could come up with. It is simply named and gives a Docker image. So that's the kind of Docker and piece. That's the most minimal, but the things that you could also have in this dev container, so by default it's just a JSON file. We're all big JSON fans, right? You can specify where the code gets run, so that's the image piece. It can understand just a regular Docker file. You can hand it Docker compose files. And then there's a bunch of templates provided by the containers.dev project, so you could just basically list the template from them, which would have a bunch of things prepackaged with a Docker file. You can also add features to your dev container. So say I don't want to edit, like someone's given me a Docker file, it's kind of big and scary, I don't want to try and figure out how to add, you know, maybe I need a CLI tool like the Azure CLI or the AWS CLI to deploy something. I don't really want that to be a part of like the actual project's Docker container. So that would be a good candidate for a feature that you could add that would add whatever tools or maybe like I cannot work without my, you know, without using Vim or Fish or something like that for my terminal. You could add tools and stuff like that with features. And technically under the hood, basically what those are is they're separate Docker containers that get built and merged in. They are great if you have kind of use cases like that. It can slow down the process. So that's kind of the trade-off of like just adding everything as features. And the last piece is customization. So this is where if you say, you know, you're working on a data science project, you're using VS Code, you have the Jupyter extension, you have like maybe the Python environments extension, maybe you have Copilot installed, and you send this to somebody else, their VS Code might look very different. And so this is where putting those sorts of settings and extension requirements in the customization section is what makes that really easy, that then when they open this dev container, because there's basically just a one-click button workflow there or from GitHub, it will look exactly the same, so you won't have to be like, I don't have that button there, or the paths aren't set up for the different tools. And because there are different editors are different, right now, you know, how those settings are interpreted may not be necessarily consistent, but, you know, some of the more basic things like setting paths and stuff should be pretty okay. So if I were to kind of like make a medium tier dev container example here and build that out, you can see we would have you still have a name. Here I've specified a Docker file directly. So that's basically, I just put it right in the repo right next to this JSON file. Yep, right next to. I've added a feature here. I wanted to use the Azure Developer CLI to deploy, maybe I've got a web app going on in this container. And I want to make sure that because I have a Conda environment, as you can see here, I want to make sure that when VS Code does things with Python, that it actually is interpreting all of the Python through my particular Conda environment. And of course, I do actually want the Python extension installed. So that kind of gives you like at least a little bit of example of each of the categories for a dev container file. And just as an example, this is kind of the standard Docker file that I use for my stuff because I do a lot of things in scientific Python. I'm often using Conda for package management. And so like, I can write something as short and or simple as this, where I just start with a mini Conda and, whatever you can do with a Docker file, you can do here. But this happens to be something that can help speed up your Docker builds. If you don't want to write things from scratch, as always, there are a lot of really great templates. And if you, in VS Code or when you're creating these from GitHub, you get these nice kind of like wizard walkthrough sort of things. In VS Code, you need to install the remote development extension. That also has things like the VS Code connect over SSH to a remote thing, other remote server connection options. So dev containers is just another one of those options. And yeah, you can, they have things you can see here in the screenshot. Anaconda is just kind of like a pre-made one. That Docker file I showed you is basically what this template is. So whatever you're doing, whether it's Python or Go, Rust, there's a huge list of template options that are, a good place to start from, and you can go from there. Yeah, and what it will look like once you go through that wizard is it will basically just add these files, probably not necessarily the no-op one. That's just a hack for Conda. But it will basically add this .dev container directory to your project. So that's kind of an overview of what a dev container is. It's a JSON file with possibly a Docker file to describe how to develop on your project. So one of the the thing that got me really excited about these is, as an open source maintainer and someone who helps onboard a lot of folks to open source projects, that first kind of real big barrier is getting people started on the project, right? You can spend a lot of time writing the getting started guide and stuff, but invariably it's a lot of work to keep maintained and stuff. So yeah, people can read through your contributing guides, but I don't know, that's usually when I approach a new open source project, that's what I end up contributing is fixes or changes to the getting started guide. But instead, what if you could provide a dev container either for getting started, or if I'm running into a bug, like one of the most common things, here, if I were to go here, I'm filing an issue. The maintainer, we've been going back and forth on the issues, and somebody else can't repro it. If I can basically give a dev container that repros, because the problem might be just in the code, in which case a dev container would be sufficient, but maybe there's some interaction with other extensions, either in other people's editors or my editor. So providing the dev container should be a pretty surefire way to help them reproduce whatever problems I'm running into. And even if they don't necessarily use VS Code, they can, anyone who's working on the open source project, who's working on GitHub, can actually start up and launch a dev container directly from GitHub. The service is called Codespaces. Everyone gets a free 60 hours a month if you have an enterprise account, or you're an education account, you might have more. But it's really nice because there's basically it's baked into the interface, even in PRs, where you can say, here, whatever the current dev container configuration is in the project, or like I had the example here, I linked to a gist of my dev container. They can just, paste that in and start. As long as they have internet, they can reproduce that. And when you do that, you get a choice of where you might have multiple configurations in your project. But you also can choose the size of machines. So if I'm working on something that's like maybe a machine learning project, and there's even now GPU ones available, so you can actually do model training and stuff like that in these code spaces, which is pretty cool. And as I was mentioning before, if we're working on this not in an issue, but there's already a PR open, literally from the UI, I can click and just launch it directly into a code space from that branch. So it makes it really easy if I can't figure out how they're getting to this, this error or this bug. I can just reproduce it right from my browser. So yeah, that's kind of one way that these dev containers can really help in the kind of open source project collaboration space. The second kind of example I wanted to give you is if you're teaching or doing a workshop or something like that. I'm gonna grab some water real quick. So, especially if you are an instructor who maybe doesn't do DevOps for a living, or wants to kind of skip, you're running a tutorial and you want to, how many times, for folks here in the room, if you have run a tutorial workshop, something like that, do you spend at least half the time getting people started installing things? Every time? Yeah, basically. There's quite a few hands up here. So yeah, basically what I really like having dev containers for is it's my go-to fallback. Like, everyone can always set up the project however they like. Maybe they are just super great at things. They know how to do local stuff, or they want to run on their cluster somewhere else. But if everything else fails, I can give them a link, a URL that they can click on that will launch this dev container from GitHub, and it will be configured exactly. I will know exactly what it will look like, exactly how it should set things up. So it's a really great kind of fallback for those sorts of situations. And the GitHub education folks have also put together a bunch of, because they have the classroom stuff, or if you're hosting all of your class projects on GitHub, there's lots of templates and utilities that can kind of help you set these up for your projects. Something else that can kind of make the experience with dev containers in the cloud hosting environment nicer is you can set up pre-builds. So, as we all know, sometimes Docker takes a hot second to, whether it's because your download speed at a conference center is very slow, or there's a lot of stuff to build. You can basically set up, you could do this via actions as well, but there's just a nice UI in the settings for your repo that allows you to set up pre-builds, so that basically you launch the code space, or you launch the dev container in code spaces as fast as the UI for VS Code can load, basically. So I usually set those up, whenever I have changes to the configuration, it'll rebuild it. They can, depending on how big your project is, potentially be a little bit costly, but that's a great thing to kind of help you either work on optimizing your dev container, or kind of managing how frequently you rebuild things. And on top of that, you can also use dev containers in conjunction with LiveShare, which is another really cool VS Code feature that allows you to kind of, in real time, have multiple people working in the same container with you. I actually, when I was doing live coding on Twitch, would post a link to my dev container via LiveShare in the Twitch chat, and would have people from Twitch help live code with me. Don't worry, I did not give them any permissions. It was view only. I didn't want to have my whole machine absolutely destroyed. But the nice thing is it would still be in a dev container, so assuming they couldn't couldn't escape the Docker containerization, we would have been fine. But it's just a really great, it's a lot of great options for collaborating with other folks. So as kind of a case study for this teaching example, I actually collaborated with NumPy at one point to set up a dev container for their project, because they have a really cool thing where they do monthly newcomer sprints. So if you haven't ever contributed to an open source project before, or maybe haven't contributed to NumPy, you can hop on a call with a bunch of folks who either have or who can help. And setting up development environments, they had tried a bunch of other tools that kind of were just really ungangly to maintain, to make sure that it was an easy experience for those new contributors. So we tried out setting up dev containers, and they've been using it ever since, and it just is a really nice experience that, at least so far, have gotten pretty good feedback on. You can always check out the scientific-python.org/calendars for all of the cool NumPy and other scientific Python ecosystem sprints. So I think we have enough time. I'm going to try the live demo thing. I have a repo here at aka.ms/pycon_dev containers, or the QR code if you like. So that's basically what I'll be currently showing you. Oh, here, stop. Please stop. Okay, cool. We just had to get out of escape PowerPoint. Okay, so I've got my local VS Code here. I am going to open this repo that I already showed you that's on GitHub. So this is locally on my machine. I'm gonna, Docker said that it crashed, so I'm gonna give that a second to relaunch. When you're using dev containers locally, you have to have basically a working Docker install or some way to host Docker containers on your machine. So, or a place you can connect to that hosts Docker. Yep. Okay, so live demo local option doesn't work, but hey, I have another option. I can go to, so here's, boop, boop, boop. Here's the, yes, I'll give feedback later. Here's the repo that I showed you the link to. This is our dev container file here. I basically have a few extensions here that are relevant. I've got a Jupyter Notebook sort of demo in the repo. But otherwise, it's pretty simple, and it has that Docker file that I showed you earlier, which basically just uses conda to set up the environments. So I could actually just go do this. You can see I've actually already created a few dev containers here. I will, studious intervention sounds cool. So this is already built, but I set up the pre-builds. So basically it's using the pre-built options, or the pre-built image. And it's basically loading as fast as I have internet. But yeah, like I can be up and running with a project, or, if nothing else on your machine is working, it's decided to give up on life. You can, as long as you have internet and a browser, you can actually get started with the code space. And dev containers. I've got a lot of extensions here that are loading. But yeah, so you can see here, conference Wi-Fi is a little bit slow. You can do it. Anyway, if I were probably tethered to my phone, it might be a little bit faster. But anyway, I think hopefully you can see what I'm trying to show here. You can also, if say you're working with a classroom or something like that that uses like Jupyter Lab, you can actually change front ends for the dev containers as well when you're like launching through code spaces, so that they see Jupyter Lab instead of VS Code, in case that's kind of too overwhelming or not something that they're looking for, or wouldn't necessarily want to use for the project. So let's go back here. Yeah, and if you say you were just like wanted to do some Scratch stuff around and wanted to get started, like I mentioned before, there's all kinds of blank templates. You can just start with launch a code space, choose a template dev container, launch in code spaces, and then if you want to later export that to a repo, but you don't have to like commit to making a repo first. And something that can also be nice about these is if you do have settings for your VS Code or your editor that you do like, it merges with your local settings with what the dev container settings are. So, yeah. I can wrap up here in just a second. But yeah, so dev containers specify a full development environment with your code, your editor, your color themes, all the preferences that go into what it means to develop on your project. It helps speed up collaboration, gives you a fallback if everything else isn't working, and makes it really easy to share and reproduce bugs. That includes kind of more things than copying and pasting a bunch of logs and going back and forth and back and forth. And they can also help make teaching easier by reducing constraints, making it really easy for educators to just start with a template and know that all the students are kind of working with the same setup. So yeah, my closing stanza is, pray develop easy now, my environ's ever ready. Okay, let's just try dev containers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We may have time for maybe one or two questions if there's anyone. There's a mic right here.
Would it be possible to switch back? Because it did finally load.
Oh.
If not, that's fine.
Yep, there you go.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it did finally load. Sweet. Well, thank you so much for coming, and if you have any other questions about dev containers, find me outside.